Welcome back to the Governor's Summit on Equitable Collaboration. If you're just joining us now, we're starting the second half of our plenary, where we are introducing the 6 elements of equitable collaboration. I'm delighted to turn this over now to my longtime colleague and friend and mentor, Dr. Frank Dukes, Distinguished Institute Fellow at our Institute for Engagement and Negotiation, and also Leanne Nurse, who is an Environmental Protection Specialist with the US EPA Office of Policy. Now I will turn this over to Frank and Leanne.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And let me ask the tech folks if I can be allowed to share the screen now so that we can have the PowerPoint. There we go. And so everybody should be able to see our beginning slide, the Governor's Summit, and an introduction to equitable collaboration. So welcome, everybody. Welcome back after the opening round that we have. I'm Frank Dukes. I'm with, as Tanya said, the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at the University of Virginia, and pleased to be asked to give this introduction to equitable collaboration, along with someone that I learned a lot from, Leanne Nurse, who will be sharing this together. So what we will be doing is basically going through, well, what is equitable collaboration and why are we using that? What is different about it? And what are the circumstances that say that this is something useful for us to be able to do? So we will have maybe 20 minutes of presentation, and then we will open it up for questions and comments. We have 358 and growing people, so we'd ask you to put your comments in the chat. And we're actually going to be asking a number of questions during our presentation too that you can do in the chat too. So Leanne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you everyone for being here. This is such an exciting development in the history of the Commonwealth. My day job is at the United States Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Policy, where I started working at EPA in 1989, but I have been affiliated with the Institute for about 20 years, since the first of the Natural Resources Leadership Institute courses and programs. I feel really privileged to be working with Frank and Tanya, and also exploring this notion of equitable collaboration, which we will show you today is a different take on the kinds of traditional public engagement we may be using to make public decisions. So without going into more detail, I'm going to ask Frank to lead us into our conversation and really see where we go with it, because all of you have very deep experience, deep curiosity, and we welcome that in our conversation today.
Okay, and then what we'd like to do actually to begin is actually drop in the chat the name of someone and their relationship to you that you think of when you think of equity. So ground yourself in that person's memory during this session. And Leanne, I think you were going to offer an example.
Yes, the person that I'm going to include in the chat is named Harriet Jacobs. Harriet was a slave who lived for 7 years in the crawl space of an attic of a shack on the plantation where she was held captive. And over that 7 years, her relatives would bring her children so that she could hear their voices through the floorboards. Eventually, Harriet escaped to Washington, D.C., where she served as a nurse for Civil War soldiers, and her daughter became a teacher at Howard University. So I'm going to put Harriet Jacobs' name in the chat box because she represents equity and freedom for me.
And we invite others to do the same. So what is equitable collaboration? So we're gonna get into some more depth in a little bit, but just to name the different components that we have. So inclusive, responsive, truth-seeking, deliberative, adaptive, and undergirding all of these, what we're calling trauma-informed. And we're gonna go into more depth about what those mean shortly, and giving some examples and asking you some questions about this too. I think we're gonna begin with some stories though first. And my stories actually begin on the West Coast in a place called Bainbridge Island, which is the place that's quite famous for some great movie and a great book, Snow Falling on Cedars, but also the very first place in the country where the Japanese Americans were disembarked, taken away from their homes and put into the concentration camps from there. And most of them American citizens. And that was a place that I was working in the early 2000s on a contaminated site, the same location. And then another space, Gilt Edge, a gold mine in the Black Hills of South Dakota, a heavily contaminated site, claimed by the Lakota Sioux, a claim that was upheld in the Supreme Court, but for which a remedy was never made. And then closer to home, Hagerstown, Maryland, where there was another heavily contaminated site. And a gentleman there who was joining us in this work that we were doing to figure out within the community and with the community, what could be done with the site and what were we going to do with it after it's cleaned up. And he had cancer, his girlfriend had cancer, and had died of cancer. His sister had cancer and had died of cancer. All of them used to play in the discard piles by this site. And what I was learning in the early 2000s was that what I thought of as intrusions at first, the history of trauma that was intruding itself on our efforts to clean up the site and determine what to do with it, was not in fact intrusion at all. And that what we had, the standards of ordinary public engagement, hold a meeting for whoever shows up, were woefully inadequate to deal with the types of issues that I was seeing in those in those circumstances, and woefully inadequate to address the concerns of today as well.
Those are great stories, Frank. I think when we pull the lens out just a little bit to see how trauma-informed considerations influence the work of equitable collaboration, I wanted to offer a generic example, although it is one that I have experienced at more than a few meetings, both public meetings, community, faith-based meetings, and take the point of view of several of the actors. What if you're in a meeting where you're trying to make a scientific or policy decision? Everything is dry, everything is factual, the charts are up on the boards. And someone begins crying very loudly in the meeting. This happened to me in Hampton Roads at the ABEX Superfund site, where the city and the housing authority had deliberately built public housing on top of 33,000 parts per million of lead, which had been dumped many years before. What do you do as the decision maker when crying is not on the agenda? What do you do as the facilitator when you have planned and trained your presenters carefully to speak plain language, to present the charts clearly, and to invite all the right people to the meeting? And what do you, as the person who is crying, the community representative, feel when people overlook and ignore your trauma? So we're going to talk more about why this particular approach to public engagement is really critical to recognizing many of the elements that have not previously been considered. Frank?
Thank you for sharing that story too. So if we look at some of the characteristics of some of the really intractable contemporary issues, and some of those characteristics, the multiple parties that we see that often with overlapping or unclear authority and responsibility. We heard the story as President Ryan introduced our Governor Northam, of meeting with someone subject to opioid addiction, a classic case. Homelessness, water quality, community safety, where no one agency or group of people can fully address the problems. The widespread landscapes of harm, including trauma. Think of monuments, memorials, or historic sites of slavery, or the ways that our racial history litters so many issues, including health, employment, education, and more. These have endured for generations, hidden to so many of us, but made visible to larger numbers through events such as the murder of George Floyd and the racialized impacts of COVID-19, or whole sections of our Commonwealth struggling when the economy falls out from under them, as happened with textiles and tobacco in Southside, or in far Southwest Virginia with the loss of mining employment. Competing narratives, competing stories. Now we have a substantial number of issues where people do not trust formal expertise. Think of our recent presidential election, or COVID-19 vaccines, or ordinary childhood immunizations, or permitting for any number of environmental issues. Conflicting individual and collective identities at stake. Go back to the monuments and memorials again, where one group of people, they represent the heroism of their ancestors, while to another group of people, they're the sustaining markers of white supremacy. Challenges to public and private leaders. Put simply, the level of trust in our institutions that shape policy are far below what we need to sustain a healthy democracy. Intersectionality, the idea of wicked problems where there's no simple formula. You can't simply say, well, we do A and we add that to B and there's going to be a C. They're much more challenging than that. And then ultimately this need for change, that we know that status quo is simply not acceptable.
So let's think about what the status quo in public engagement may have brought us. Many of the methods that we've used simply don't incorporate a broad perspective of who the public is. Public officials are not necessarily trained that way. And then there are often methods that are not particularly suitable for a specific community or a specific set of concerns or for a specific locale. There are many times that we have legal restrictions. We have policy concerns. We can only make a decision about X, but there may be A through Z, other kinds of concerns that people have. You may not have staff capacity. How many of you have tried to create a dialogue around a particular issue? You need a specialist who's familiar with that issue. You don't have the budget for it. You don't have the time. You have a deadline to meet. Many of our traditional methods along the inform, communicate, and direct choices along that spectrum are not useful for these intersectional problems that we have. And unfortunately, say for those of us who are facilitators, then the actual field of dispute resolution continues to be predominantly white, and there are very few opportunities for people of color to get the kind of training, the kind of practice, the kind of mentoring that is required to be able to work across a wide variety of situations. Then there's inertia. If a problem has been long-standing and nobody's bothered to fix it, why do we have to fix it now? And when we look at what we're facing in terms of climate change and racism, in terms of the pandemic, so many of the problems, especially the inequities of access, information, and actual solutions, they've been around for a long time. It's just that now we need to make the change. We need to decide what is the best way forward, and equitable collaboration offers us that opportunity. So again, why do we want to make this shift? The ordinary, usual run-of-the-mill, pro forma processes often add additional harm. If there's no attention to the specific needs of a specific community or a specific group of affected people, then you can make a decision that's legally defensible, but it may not be trusted. You may not be able to enforce the choice that you make. And authentic engagement, really listening to people, not just listening to them because you're supposed to keep your eyes on them, but actually listening with your head and your heart, depends on equitable processes. And this goes back to your planning process. The outcomes that are equitable depend on processes that are inclusive. So again, we feel that institutions and communities can produce more authentic, equitable, and legitimate outcomes if you adopt the equitable collaboration process to guide your deliberations.
So again, we've got the 6 elements of equitable collaboration here, and we're going to go through one at a time, but just to show them all, because they are of a piece. They are all collectively. So trauma-informed, the idea that we're actually recognizing and acknowledging and preparing for trauma that might show up in a process. Inclusion beyond simply holding a meeting that's open to everybody, that's reaching all segments of the community, and acknowledging that there are different ways that different people need to participate. Being responsive throughout the process, so acknowledging and responding to community questions, needs, and concerns. Truth-seeking, the idea of we need more honest and more complete histories, especially when they're painful to hear and understand. Deliberation, deliberative, this idea of brave spaces where participants can be honest and open, confronting their past and present, and sharing civic thinking. And then adaptive. We're not actually saying that this is a formula. It can't be a formula, but you actually need to craft the response unique to each community and each situation.
So we're going to spend a few minutes really diving into this notion of trauma-informed collaboration. Why do we bring it up? Why are we thinking of it as one of the key anchor elements of this system of processes? And one of the reasons is that when we go to a situation that we say and we observe and we experience in the present day, we may not have done the homework to find out what are the historical traumas associated with this situation. You will notice when Tanya opened the session this morning, she gave tribute to the traditional stewards of the land where the university is located. We know that the quote unquote original sin of our nation is the genocide of the native peoples and then the establishment of the African slave trade. So we may not be thinking about that when we have to decide on a zoning choice. But given today's complexities, if we do not become aware of, incorporate, and find an appropriate space for that, then we may be tripping up on old issues that suddenly pop out. One of the things we want to do with this slide also is to pose these questions so that as you go into your breakouts and also as you go forward in your work, you can consider what may be things that you need to consider. What other populations, for example, might be vulnerable to additional harm during the process? In the reference that I made to the lead dump, the eventual resolution was to move and to disperse an entire community of young women, mostly with school-age children who had lived together most of their lives. This was done in the name of quote-unquote risk reduction. Yes, it reduced the risk, the physical harm to the people who were living there, but it destroyed the social fabric of the community itself. And it happened to be a lot cheaper than cleaning up the site and leaving the people to live there in place. So how are you going to prepare for questions like that? How are you going to make a whole cycle chart of your planning process so that you say, well, our preferred choice is X, and then let it go at that? But we really have to think about, well, who is affected, not just at the beginning of the process, but who is affected by your choice and your outcomes? So how do you prepare for that? How do you do that as a decision maker within the constraints of your legal and regulatory processes? How do you do that as a facilitator or a mediator, given the fact that you are supposed to be neutral? So how do you prepare for that as an active community advocate? How do you get what you need to have on the table considered? So these are things that we want to ask you to consider. And one of the things that Frank has really evolved conversation about is this notion of a brave space. So what is a brave space? It's a space where people feel actively embraced and considered, and therefore can say what needs to be said. One of the earlier speakers talked about the need for honest conversation. And there is a way to have honest conversation, to be respectful. But if you don't make the intentional plan for that, it's not likely to happen. And people will say all kinds of things that create all kinds of triggers. Now, what kinds of traumatic reenactments might have unintended consequences? So if you design a plan that says, we're going to go to this site and we're going to look at the time when these people were released from slavery, but then they were recaptured. Now, these are all real stories and occurrences. Or say a certain tribal group lived. I was raised in my own development to be told that my great-grandmother was an Eastern Band Cherokee member. About 2 years ago, I found that there was no genetic evidence to back that up. However, throughout my whole life, I was very proud to say to people, well, I'm also part Indian. And that's a form of recognizing trauma for African descended people to account for mass rape and sexual violence, rather than to say that I'm the product of violence. We have woven a set of stories about belonging to another set of people. So trauma-informed design is particularly crucial nowadays because people may not even recognize their relationship to established trauma, but you as planners and decision makers want to consider that. So we're going to go to the next one. And these are just a few things to consider in your facilitation when you're thinking about trauma-informed facilitation. So you want to acknowledge the harm that has done and promote consciousness, awareness about things that have happened in the past that may not seem to be obviously connected to today's decision, but in acknowledging those harms, you show consideration to the people who have been affected, who may carry those concerns forward. You want to promote safety beyond the standard. Do the lights come on? Are the steps clear? Is it an ADA space? You want to promote the social safety of being able to speak up, to be heard, and to be considered. We want to honor history and celebrate culture, and also take the time as we're going to make the community growth and accomplishments visible. Don't just write an issue paper, don't just publish a notice, but you can celebrate your successes as well. So this is, Frank will go to the next one. This is one of the most difficult things that change makers have to do, and that is to trauma-informed self-care. How many of you, just raise your hand, have trouble taking care of yourself while you're taking care of everybody else? I should see several hundred hands go up, because you have, out of all the people in the world, decided to make a difference, which means that many other people are not necessarily where you are in terms of evolution or consideration. So getting something as basic as sleep is really critical. Rewarding yourself periodically. Those of us who are self-sacrificing or who have been raised to be self-sacrificing do not see our work as something to celebrate. We see it as a duty or as an obligation, but why don't we think about it as something for which we are worthy of consideration by ourselves, not because somebody else does that for us. Exercising, and this is one of my challenges multiple times during the week, helps change your pace, it improves your brain function, and of course, adds to your longevity.
So we're not going to read these questions that we have for each of the other ones, but just to recognize that for each of these elements that we have, that there's a set of questions that you can be asking yourself in order to define what would be an equitable process for this particular set of goals that you have in this particular situation. So how many of you have ever had the experience of being left out of something that was meaningful to you, or being invisible in a room, despite the fact that you were there? I think a lot of hands being raised. If learning and growth is to be enduring, it has to reach all segments of the community. And how do we move from an inclusion that says, this is a public meeting, all may attend, to inclusion that seeks out, welcomes, and honors diverse participation? An inclusion that acknowledges racial, ethnic, and gender, and class, and other dynamics in ways that provide for a wide spectrum of participation. And by the way, again, please feel free to keep posting your thoughts in ideas about inclusion.
Yeah. One of the things that people say nowadays is they don't trust public decision making. They don't trust the people. They don't trust the process. But why is that? Who's been working on community issues already? This is something that in your planning you must recognize. You may not know the answer, but there are other people such as third parties. For example, if you yourself are making a public decision, you don't know who the actors are. You can go to active civic groups. You can go to faith-based organizations. You can go to trade groups. In Texas, following Rita and Katrina and the dislocation of not just Vietnamese boat people, but the destruction of nail and hair salons, the nail salon workers unified together and came to EPA to talk about the kinds of safety information that they needed. What if we had never looked at that? What if nobody at EPA had even understood that that was a question mark? So responsiveness is more than just posting your decision. It's going through the process of listening actively, acknowledging people's concerns. And there are lots of third parties who can help us do this, but we need to do the homework of finding out who they are. That last point about how information will be used and how decisions will be implemented is critical. When we think about tribal issues, for example, we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, then we have to think about issues of privacy and disclosure. And the same thing happens in commercial decisions. Confidential business information may or may not be available if you choose to use it, or if you are not allowed legally to use it, you have to explain to people why that is, so that their input and their concerns just don't go off into a hole somewhere and disappear.
So truth seeking, and I know a lot of people are familiar with fact finding, but facts are not the only truths, right? You know that people have stories, that can help us understand what's actually going on in ways that the simple facts are not able to do so, even when such facts are really important, levels of water quality, whatever the case might be. And conflicts over challenging issues invariably involve competing claims, and at times multiple truths, as well as multiple untruths. So how do we invite honest, more complete knowledge and understanding, especially when such knowledge may be painful to hear and to understand? Again, feel free to enter other questions that you might be able to have in order to elicit the sort of truth-seeking and ideas that you have in the chat.
So the deliberative element is critical because community engagement that begins by simply acknowledging or asking people to comment on predetermined decisions polarizes people. So what we're asking people to do is to consider the amount of deliberation you need, where are the facts missing, and what you need to do to bring people together on the common concerns.
And I think we really want to foster shared civic thinking, and not by a false civility that privileges order over candor, but by acknowledgement that we all can learn and grow, and institutions and communities need to do so together. And finally, adaptive. Again, determining the most appropriate process for each situation is not just a question of effectiveness, it's a way of respecting people's time. And each institution or community needs to use the appropriate process to achieve the goals for their particular issue, as well as adapting to changing circumstances throughout the process. So that's our introduction. Again, feel free to enter questions that you might add to these or questions you have for us. And I think rather than showing the slides up here, I really recognize I can't really see the chats. We've got 99, so I'm going to stop the sharing. And Leanne, maybe you can start us off with addressing some of the questions that we have in the chat.
Yeah, let's look at this. We've got one from Jerome about a lack of trust and an unwillingness to recognize. Jerome, let me get back to you because we are filling up so fast. Lack of trust and an unwillingness to recognize. I'm presuming that it's to recognize verifiable truth is a huge challenge in this space. So definitely there's a lack of trust and unwillingness to recognize verifiable truth. So we go back to the notion of what is true. We know from psychological studies, a lot of polling, that people are leading with their emotions. And those of us with science backgrounds would like to think that we're only working on observable facts. But even those facts, the way we present them, the way we consider them with others, is fully informed by various emotional factors. So the challenge for change leaders is to decide to what extent have we cleaned up our own filters, and to what extent can we acknowledge the kinds of emotional loading that goes on in critical conversations. So that is a matter of training. It's also a matter of understanding culture. So I don't know that that's a perfect answer for that question, but following that is Bakura, who says that academia is good for that too, discrediting and invalidating the ideals of non-degreed peoples and communities. So you've now hit a nerve for me, Bakura, because for 48 years, I did not have my degree, and I trained a lot of people, did a lot of work in various academic and government and business settings. However, the week after I got my master's degree, which was a few years ago, I was suddenly offered a brand new job at the agency. People praised me as though I had been, quote unquote, an overnight success. And I have lived through that experience of being discredited, invalidated, or just ignored mostly. And I think that it's critical to talk about knowledge as more than just the observable facts. It doesn't mean that we disregard facts. It means that in acknowledging other ways of knowing and other ways of making experience, that we can draw more people and have a wider chance of getting good choices in our decisions. When we ignore those options and situations, then what we frequently will be is challenged at the end of the cycle. Well, where were you before? Why didn't you come to the meeting before? Because they weren't really invited in a way that's respectful. So we've got 7 more messages.
I see a number of people that have their hands raised. Please, okay. We've got over 400 people. We really need to put it in the chat, unfortunately. So, yeah. And by the way, there are some great resources that people are posting in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah.
I see a question, Kim Bridges. How do you see these elements playing out differently in public processes in particular, where conditions of safety needed for brave spaces can be uniquely challenged when everything's being broadcasted and recorded? It's a wonderful question. And of course, there's a transparency that we need to have. And yet some of these are very difficult and we know that some people that may have important views or just need to have something to say, hate speaking in front of in front of public, and particularly when they think that their views may be discounted or they might be discounted too. Give a little example. A wonderful co-facilitator and I, Dr. Walker, in Danville, and some downstream communities. 2014, Duke Energy had the coal ash spill, and the downstream communities were meeting in North Carolina and Virginia, but we're meeting with Duke Energy. And that we actually took our time to, we did about 20 formal interviews with people ahead of time, where we were doing it one-on-one and talking with people so that they were able to say to us, what is the deepest concern that you have? And then continuing that availability, even though the meetings that we had ultimately with the stakeholder group and Duke Energy were public meetings, but making the opportunity for people to be able to speak in private, and also allowing for them to be able to have conversation. There were a number of conversations between the Dan River Basin Association, which is the largest and most important watershed group in that area, and Duke Energy, that they had privately, as well as other people doing so as well. So I think that the other element of that, the conditions of safety, is something to be able to name and then invite the people who are participating to say, how's this going to work for you? How's that going to be helpful? So Leanne, do you want to take another
yeah,
question?
we have one which is fascinating. It says, how can we help shift workplace culture that rewards radical self-care and trauma-informed processes for facilitation? Now, I'm going to take a guess because we have so many people, we won't have private conversation, but I'm hoping that that means, how do we make that happen more frequently, and how do we provide support for it? One of the difficulties with this, as you know, is if you're in one of those jobs where you're online, on duty every minute of the day, it's a battle for you yourself to make borders and to create the time that you need. And to me, there's the business of self-care, which is the individual choice. And then as we move further out, is how can we both model for our colleagues and also exhort our managers and our leaders to make space for these things to happen. In the federal service, there's all kinds of services like this that are available, but many people have positions that require them to be online all day, every day. So what do those people do, especially if the children are screaming in the background, the neighbors are doing whatever they're doing. So it's both a choice for personal self-care and becoming strong enough in holding that space for yourself, and inquiring and advocating for support for others to do the same.
We did have a question about sending the slideshow. So again, this session will be recorded and accessible. And then if it's possible, I'm certainly glad to share the slideshow. So that'll be a technical question. We'll see whether we can, include the PowerPoint. I see Tanya nodding. I'm surprised out of 412 people you show up on my screen, Tanya, but you're nodding that's going to be okay. So another question, when you reach, I think these are really common, when you reach out to the community, to churches, PTAs, barbershops, salons, and you cannot gain participation, what can you do? So a common question, and part of that, of course, has to do with trust. If there's mistrust within those communities, then why would they bother participating in something if they've seen their involvement has been denigrated or has been otherwise discounted for such a long period of time, or they simply don't have the time to be able to do that? I'll give another example, and not everybody has the luxury of being able to do this, but over a decade ago, we were beginning to do work in far Southwest Virginia, in some of the coal mining regions and adjacent regions around the economy and environment. And we spent well over a year, and my colleague Christine Gouvet may be on here also, did that. Well over a year, actually talking with people, meeting with people, holding small group meetings before we actually had our very first meeting, to try to build the trust, and the trust that came not from, trust me, I'm from the University of Virginia, because that's not real trust. But the trust that comes from, we've talked to you, we've listened to you, here's what we hear, here's what we understand, who else do you think we should be talking to? And then following up with that. And so that sort of engagement and relationship building and trust building is the only way I think that you can actually end up being able to do that. We know that doesn't work. It's not something that can be done quick. And we didn't invent this, but we've heard the term or the phrase to be able to travel at the speed of trust, and how important that can be for us to be able to do that. So that's one example of that. And it's not always going to work. And it takes some time sometimes to be able to develop that relationship so that you can start gaining that sort of participation. So listening, understanding, asking the people that you're reaching out to, what is it that you need in order to be able to participate effectively? And how should I be in order for you to be able to participate with me is important.
Yeah, thank you for that, Frank. So there's one that says, you mentioned the need many feel to be neutral, but many take this to mean lacking emotion. How do we build emotional intelligence of those engaging with these communities? Well, there's two factors that I want to point to. One is culture in science and legal professions especially. There's a clear demand, and again, when we talk about third-party participation of facilitators, there's a clear call for so-called neutrality. And since we know that 2/3 of communication is nonverbal, a huge amount of what is expressed emotionally is also nonverbal. But in the public space, there is no celebration of that. There is a strict cultural and historic provision that this is not allowed. You're not supposed to nod your head in agreement with people. You're not to lean into people as though you're paying extra attention to them. And so the question becomes, if you assess the effectiveness of your methods, then you may want to consider building emotional intelligence as part of the long tail development for business skills. This is not just a question of getting along with angry people in public meetings. It's a way of moving through life that helps you connect more deeply with people, and in the sense of public decision making, opens the space for the possibility of more effective solutions. So these issues of being neutral, there's a big debate in the conflict resolution community about the extent to which people are to remain neutral and the extent to which we need to advocate at a time where issues of racial climate justice have broken out, even though those disparities have existed for hundreds and thousands of years. So, Frank, you want to pick one?
Yeah, and I think we may just have time for one more.
And
there's so many great questions. I love you. I think, Colonel Pratt, how can truth seeking be done so that it doesn't require marginalized people to rehearse their trauma and thereby make the process harmful rather than helpful? So in other words, that how do you avoid having the people that have the trauma be the ones that have to elevate that trauma? And it's such a great question. And I think that actually beginning with that question, every single project that we work on, every single process that we work on, how can we be trauma informed? And that question is one to be able to ask. I don't know that there's a uniform answer to that.
I think it's a challenge, Frank, because people who decide, say, my faith-based organization is very diverse, and at the same time, because of old cultural markers from other societies, the presence of people of color is good for demographics, but not necessarily it's not embedded in the process of the work of our organization. So there's a group of us who've been agitating about this difference between numbers and the actual inclusion of people of color in decision making. So many organizations go through this, but one of the ways to make a space that remains safe is that the same way you talked about individual interviews, you can solicit a person who may speak on behalf of those who have particular trauma-informed issues, and that person is maybe in a position to present concerns in a way that is not as disturbing, perhaps, or may simply be a person who is trusted by others who have deep trauma-based concerns.
The example of that, we were working on the issue of sexual violence and responding to sexual violence at the University of Virginia. And rather than we had a group, a very representative group of students, staff, faculty, and alumni. And rather than asking people who were survivors of sexual violence to come speak to the group, we had a much smaller group of people who had counseling training and experience meet with them separately and then bring back But that's, I think there are some answers to that, but I think the answers are going to have to look to the people who have been marginalized for their answers to that, and don't put them on the spot. And it may mean there's another project we're working on now where we need to do some work with the majority group before they actually can even meet with the people that are in the marginalized position, to be able to examine questions of privilege and examine, cultures of white supremacy and other elements for that. So these are great questions. I think we're actually at the end of our time for this. Is that right, Tanya? I think we're going into the breakouts.
I think we're just about at time. We are. And what I would invite you to do, both of you, is to maybe put in the chat a link to the Transforming Community Spaces, and just say a word, if you could, about what they can find there, the toolkit for equitable collaboration.
And Tanya, will the chats be available too? Because there's, again, lots of resources from people.
Everything's going to be saved, and there's tremendous resources. I'm very excited to see what's happening in the chat. Just really fantastic.
And I will look through these. We will be meeting next week and looking at, recommendations. And so next week's process, I will take a look at these. I won't promise an answer to all of these, but they will inform the work that we do next week. So we didn't actually, I'm not sure how technically works for people to go into the breakout groups now.
Well, Frank, I'll do that. And okay. while I introduce that, if you could put into the chat box the link to the toolkit for equitable collaboration.
I think actually it's already in the tool. It's already in there.
It's in the stack.
Just post it again. That would be great. Okay, so I do want to note, I've been asked to share with you, I think it's already been in the chat, but just to reiterate that there were also questions for Dr. Underwood that we were not able to explore with her, but we have captured those as well. We are about ready to enter the third part of our morning. It's already been so rich, and yet there's more to come. We are excited to offer to you a rich array of 12 different case studies across the topics of health, education, natural resources, and community development. There will be 2 rounds of about 35 minutes each, and each case study will be offered twice. So you'll get to see 2. If you're not able to get into the case study of your choice, you will be able to get into the second round, we hope. If for some reason that case study is wildly popular and you can't get into it here while it's live, please know we are recording all of these and you'll be able to access it later on the website.